start, Sara, say hello to the people. I've just been running my mouth that's unfair for 3 minutes straight.
Not at all really useful stuff. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. We are so thrilled you've taken the time out today to be with us.
Okay. Thank you for letting the people know I am not a selfish human and I can share the talk space. So that is Sara. You'll be hearing a lot from her today. So for those of you who do not know, Fearless Futures, we engage in inclusion and equity work with organizations globally, mostly trainings, but oftentimes, a considerable amount of the time we engage in consultancy work, advisory work, and whether we're training, a group of C-suite or whether we're working with a DEI team internally on, a policy or process that they may want to revamp and make more equitable. It goes without saying that recruitment is going to come up in the conversation, even if that's not why we were brought in, even that's not the discussion at hand when we're in a in-person circle or in a virtual space. Recruitment comes up constantly. And oftentimes the conversation is, how do we get more folks of color, more folks, more women, more non-binary, trans folks, disabled, like whatever marginalized group they're focused on, how do we get them in the door? Just how? Where is the talent? We cannot find them anywhere. How do we get them in the door? That is a hot topic. And we will engage depending on context and space. And again, is this a training? Are we advising? We will engage folks in that conversation. And in engaging folks in that conversation, we always come to a crossroad. And I'm strategically calling this a crossroad because in this conversation, we have to, at some point, talk about retention. And the key tenet of retention is the promotions process. And oftentimes, this as 3 separate entities. Recruitment is one vertical, retention is another vertical, promotions is this third vertical, and they never cross over, they never intersect. And because oftentimes they're being viewed so individually, it makes sense to us why numbers might look the way they look in terms of I'm able to recruit diverse candidates, however we're defining diverse in that moment, but I'm not able to retain them. I wonder why. So one of the things we wanted to look at is, well, let's shine a light on a process that often doesn't get, amount of attention. And that would be the promotions process. So the first thing that I wanted us to chat about is like, why are we I gave you a little bit of spiel, but with some detail, why are we focusing on the promotions process? Why does that matter? And then for those of you, who are working in your organizations, how can you make a case to your colleagues, to, those in senior leadership, whether they're your peers or your managers, why we should pay a little more attention to their promotions process. Because I've been yapping, obviously, Sara, I'm literally pointing this question to you.
Not me. I love it. Well, I think the first thing I would say is exactly, I just want to plus one on what you just said, Sable, like the retention piece. If talent from marginalized communities does not feel in your organization that they can progress, that they can achieve their career goals, and that promotion is always a part of that for so many of us, why would you stick around? So promotions, I think exactly as you just said, I just really want to underline that point because it's so important. Promotions processes are so integral to retention. And it's no good recruiting folks from marginalized communities if you don't keep them. And the second thing that comes to mind, and for me, this is so critical to how we understand promotions within our organization, is look, recruitment is essentially about who is present in our organization. A very important question, who is present? But promotions is about who and what we value as an organization. And so for me, the promotions process deeply reflects the culture of an organization. It is integral to the cultural fabric. It's an articulation of the culture of an organization. So if we focus attention on the promotions process, we're focusing our attention on a space where the culture of our organization is reproduced. We're likely to enact the greatest cultural change, which we know then can have ripple effects across our wider organization in terms of the way we do so many other things. So for me, it's because it's so integral to our culture, because it's telling us what people care about at the top in our organization. For me, that's the case.
I like that too, the use of the word value, because I think, I'm replaying different conversations in different contexts when we're talking about promotions. It's discussed in such a way where it sounds as though it's very tactical. It's like, oh, well, you have this KPIs, we have these routine performance reviews, and, a panel of folks just decided that this person is not ready, but this person has significant potential. What underlines, how we codify who's ready versus who has potential, and we're going to promote them off of potential. Even in that, like, where is our value lie?
I love that. Yeah. What do we see as important, and how do we define what we see as important? Absolutely. It's the cultural fabric of who we are as an organization.
And I think that just immediately tying it to that retention piece, some folks, their goal is not to get to senior leadership. They're really happy being individual contributors. And I mean, organizations can't run without individual contributors. That's a fact. But there are some folks who absolutely, it's a goal of theirs. By the time, they've been out of, college, uni, X amount of years, they want to be at this level, they want to be at this level, etc. Well, if you never see anyone like you at that level, your brain naturally does some deductive reasoning and determines that you can't reach it there, so you're going to go elsewhere. So you just lost that candidate.
Exactly.
Not a candidate, but you've lost that person.
And it's logical. It's so logical. And I think, so often now, I think it was you, Sable, that said this, the leaky bucket, right? So often now the focus is on, as you said, recruitment. How do we get people in the door? But if they're just going straight out, if that bucket's got a hole in it, like, how far is that effort ever going to be effective? You need to take it the whole way through.
But where do we start? We've already highlighted there's a ripple effect. So I can imagine, like, if we were in this, a room with nice, big, board, fancy chairs, and everyone's like, yes, Sara, yes, Sable, I'm with you. Where do we begin to say, okay, we're going to do something about this promotions process to make sure that it is inclusive and equitable? So maybe we've worked on our recruitment and our sourcing, and we are able to get folks from marginalized communities into the door, but we want to make sure we keep them. And we've listened to you. We're going to look at our promotions process as part of that, part of that strategy. Where would you suggest that folks begin?
Where's the starting point? Do you know what it is, Sable? I think, honestly, people are going to hate me for saying this, but I know people want me to say, do this, do that, do this. And that bias for action is there. I know that there's a real desire to get to the doing and do it now. But I honestly think the problem with talking about promotions is every organization has such a unique approach to promotions. And so there has to be, for me, 2 steps that come first. Number one, you have to map what the promotions process and landscape even looks like at your organization first. And when I say that to people, often they're like, okay, so we have this formalized document, we have this process, we fill out this form. Okay, yeah. Also, what are those informal interactions that make up the process that aren't written in stone but consistently happen? Those perhaps development coaching conversations that some managers have with their reports, but others don't. Those opportunities, all those parts that aren't formalized, they're not written in a document somewhere, but they are part of the process. The first step is just mapping all of that. What actually makes up the promotion process at your organization? Because chances are about 25%, I'm being generous there, about 25% you don't even think or see often, part of that process. And then when you've done that mapping, then taking it to the level of looking at each phase, each part of the promotion process, each informal interaction that's a part of it, and asking yourself, what barriers exist at this point for people from marginalized communities? And the danger is, if we do that very quickly, we're likely just to think about certain communities and ignore others, the first ones that come to mind. So something we use here Sable, you will have seen this so many times in our Design for Inclusion program, is a matrix where we have across the top systems of oppression, classism, racism, sexism. And then down the left-hand side, we have all the stages of a process. So you can map across in a really thorough way how each part of your promotions process impacts individual communities. Because we have to be honest, different marginalized communities may experience the promotions process at your organization very differently, because we know the ideas that exist, the assumptions that exist about certain communities are different, and so will show up differently. So for me, the first two steps, map what the process is and map those invisible parts, and then map how inequity or oppression is furthered at each part of that particular process that you have. And at that second stage where you're mapping those moments, those obstacles where inequities show up, that's where it's a really good point to go and consult with communities in your organization. Sit down with networks, sit down with ERG groups, talk to people, and get that on the ground insight of how the different phases of the promotion process play out for them. So yes, it will take time, not an immediate solution, but until you know that, you can't build or rebuild your promotions process to be equitable and inclusive, because you don't know where the problems lie.
I'm going to be a participant, if you will. I'm going to go back to that step one. Yes, we can talk to folks in, the different ERG groups and the different communities, have some focus groups, have some casual one-on-ones, but I'll be honest and share that a lot of folks might not feel, depending on the culture of the organization where it currently stands, might not even feel safe enough. And we can label safety as like psychological safety, et cetera, to say I can identify 10 things right away without feeling like there might be some level of, repercussions. What is a way that folks can highlight those invisible or informal methods to process steps in the promotion process that you just don't think about? So just to give you an idea of where my head is that I just thought of, I was talking to a friend of a friend. It was online virtual dinner. It was still in early COVID times. And she was new to a company. She's in investment banking. And she realized that she was late in the promotions process. This is an informal step because she didn't know that if you didn't verbally communicate to your manager that you wanted to be considered for the next round of promotion, that you automatically were shut out the process. But this is not written down anywhere. So her conundrum was, I like it here, but I want to get back to the title. I want to get to the next title. I made a lateral move. Do I need to look elsewhere? Am I going to sit in the same, level for another year? Of course, that level comes with less pay because you're at that level for another year, et cetera, et cetera. So with that example being, without tapping into members of, certain communities within an organization, how do we uncover these informal steps that you would only know if you'd been there? Yeah. You would only know if maybe your parents have worked in the same industry and got to a certain level or went to certain schools. How do we uncover these informal steps that people just take for granted?
Yeah, I think, and I really agree, because there's also so much difference across different teams, and even if the process is written down the same, people will use it differently, right? Yeah. So I totally agree that how do we map that in a way which is comprehensive and accurate? Two things. So the first thing that comes to mind is talking to HR about the initial intentions of the process. This is the intention. And then having conversations with line managers about how they live out the process.
I love that.
Yeah, not just getting the static sense of this is what it looks like on paper, this is what it looks like when we actually deliver it. And I love talking to line managers about promotions processes, because they'll be honest about the things that don't work for them. You also want to know, as you said, what's not working for people who are being taken through the process, not just the people that are, the implementers or the ones that are taking them through it. For that, I think something that's really, really useful, and I say this often with conversations that are tricky, where you want to get information from people, but you know that it's going to require some trust, what I really like to do, and I've stolen this from one of our colleagues, Ruby Clark, who runs our consulting, because she uses this, a really great way of getting data from folks that isn't just, I had this terrible experience and this happened, because let's face it, you have to really, really trust people to tell them that, is to use scenario-based discussions. Imagine this happened in your organization. Talk me through what would happen next.
Mm-hmm.
So people can put themselves into it and go, well, you know, if you're telling me this person got promoted, then probably what happened is they got to do this, then they did this, then they had a conversation with this person and they probably know this person. That's how you're going to get the data from people about what really goes on, rather than asking them the question, what happens to you during the promotion process? That's the dangerous question. Everyone's like, oh, you know, if I tell the truth, what's going to happen to that? But if you use scenarios or case studies, you'd be so shocked about how much richness people give you, because there's a feeling of separation there for them. Yes, they're not telling you this is exactly what's happened to me. They're telling you what they would expect to happen in their organization or their team.
That makes sense. That makes sense. And it removes, when I talked about that psychological safety, I'm not answering for me.
Yeah.
I'm answering based on what I've seen for the 18 months that I've been here. This is how that might play out. And I really, really like the idea of, first, let's talk to HR, because there are processes, they are written down. There are, for the most part, unless it's like a startup who's really going super fast, there are formal policies, but also let's talk to the folks who are supposed to execute and implement. Where are the variations occurring? Because when it doesn't work for someone, you know, the manager is not going, or the supervisor, they're not going back to HR and going, actually, step 2, you know, doesn't really vibe with my team, so I skip it. They're just skipping it. And how might that play out in terms of, like, you know, who gets to the next level, who doesn't? What I am thinking about as we're talking about this is, like, we do all this, we're doing scenarios, we got folks on our side, we need to look at promotions, the process, you know, we have to get some data, we're going to talk to people, you know, we're going to get as much information as we can, and then we're going to look at our process and we're going to make it more inclusive and equitable. And what makes me nervous, just based on the work that you and I do with organizations, is this idea of, like, oh, I'm done. Oh, look, we recruited diverse candidates for a quarter straight, or even 4 quarters straight. We've done it. We don't have to make a significant effort here anymore. We don't need to look at it ever again. You know, not that organizations do it, but this idea of, like, this was a goal, we reached it, time for the next goal. How do we make sure that we don't fall into that trap and make sure we're actually creating, like, sustainable change in our promotions process? What do you think?
How do we do that?
And how do we track this?
Yeah, how do we track it, and how do we hold ourselves to account? Always the most important. And I always say that equity and inclusion work is about experimentation. So you've got to have good evaluation and tracking methods, because you're constantly needing to experiment. I think the answer you might expect from me, and the answer I think people might expect at that point, is, oh, okay, we just look at who's been promoted, we just look at who's been recruited, look at that data. Which, yes, you can do that. There are issues with that, though, and I want to be, like, totally, you know, honest with our participants today, that there are jurisdictions around the world where you are simply not allowed to do that. You won't be able to do that effectively, you know, whether it's because of GDPR in certain countries across Europe, where if you are stratifying, say, promotions data, you know, you've put this great intervention in place, you're then trying to track your progress, you're looking at identities, you're stratifying promotions data based on identities. Well, if only one single, for instance, let's say Asian woman has been promoted, you're not going to be allowed to identify that in the data, because that person becomes identifiable. No, it's more complex than that with GDPR, but that's something we've got to be honest about. You know, look at France and Germany. You can't do traditional race demographic data collecting. So because of that, I don't want to say that. I don't want to say just go away, please, and look at who gets promoted and use that data, because that's not always going to be possible to you. The other reason I don't want to say that is because, honestly, that won't give you the best picture of what's actually going on in your promotions process. It really won't. The best thing you can do is look at using your more qualitative research tools to get to the bottom of how are people experiencing the promotions process now you've made the changes that you have. And so, for example, something there could be surveying, looking at kind of really getting rich data from people about how they feel and experience the process at different points in it, and which points of the promotion process are working for them and which points perhaps they feel their potential is not being realized. A caveat with that is, if you are surveying, we know that surveying, and I feel like I always go into the methodology box, don't I? Say, well, I'm so ready to talk about methodology all the time, but surveying is difficult in DEI work, let's be honest, because surveying gives us an aggregate picture. It tells us what's going on at the mainstream. We're not as interested in the mainstream, though, in DEI work. We're interested in the margins. And so if you are going to use surveying, it will give you a picture of what's going on with your promotions process. But I would always advise, can you do focus groups? Can you do one-to-one interviews? Using those scenarios, like I said, so that you're building trust with people. But can you do those with folks from marginalized communities specifically? So you're getting their voice and their take on what's going on, and you're not just getting an aggregate picture. That's what I'd advise for building that accountability.
I like that because, well, one, do folks feel, I'm bringing up the word safety again, but do they feel that they can be honest on a survey? Do they trust that the survey is anonymous to begin with? Even if the survey is anonymous, if you are the only woman, if you're the only Black woman, if you're the only Asian woman, if you're the only disabled Muslim woman, your survey is no longer anonymous once you answer certain open-ended questions a certain way. What then happens? So I love the idea of survey for the sake of surveying. You can't necessarily avoid the need for a survey, but when you think about who you have in your organization, is a survey going to give you a full picture? 80% of folks might say, oh my God, leadership is amazing. They always promote based on meritocracy. And, if you really work hard here, you can get promoted. And then you realize that 80% of the responders are, non-disabled cishet white men. Well, I'm just going to leave that there. What about everyone who is not? Might they think that, things are going and we should just continue on the way we've been going thus far as an org? They might have a differing opinion. How can you get that from them without sacrificing their safety or job security or job need? Oftentimes that's using an outsider, even if it's not Fearless Futures, it's just using another organization to come in and get that information if that's something that's important to you. I love the idea of, let's just not compare year one data to year two data and say like, okay, we've achieved it. Let's move on. What does it look like sustainably? Let's say an organization, I'm taking us back a couple of minutes here. So they've mapped everything and now they're analyzing. Let's say an organization, they've done all this. They've surveyed, it's been focus groups, it's been one-on-ones, and they've uncovered so much. They are just in a state of, holy cow, I did not know that all of this was happening. And it's kind of like over here in the States, we'll say a deer in headlights, AKA shock. How do you calm how do you say it's not the end of the world? This is what a way forward could look like. Like, what do you say in that moment?
Yeah, I think that can apply to a lot of policy and process areas, can't it? I think the first thing is, look, we always have to be, you'll hear me say this so many times if you've ever been to a webinar with me before, we have to be tactical. We have to choose specific areas to work on and then look at how they're improving outcomes. I think there are some really, what's great about the promotions process is, even though I say, well, do all this mapping, work out where the problems are, there are quick wins. There are things, folks, that you can be doing today, tomorrow, if you're not already, that will make your promotions process more equitable and more inclusive, right? So one thing, for instance, and you mentioned this earlier, Sable, around like who has potential and who doesn't, who's seen as having potential, I should say. do you have rubrics? Do you have written in black and white rubrics that clearly state what it takes for a person to get from this level in the organization to this level? And in those rubrics, have you interrogated the language you're using and ensured that you're not using language which essentially encourages behaviors that for some people will be positive, but in others will be read negatively? And I want to give an example for that, and I talk about this a lot with people. You know, if you have in your rubrics, somebody's got to be commanding, have gravitas, get things right, win the argument, which I've seen in some places over the years.
It's in the job description.
Right. You know, these are really common things. For some people, when they show those attributes, they will be celebrated for them. But there are some people, because of their identity, that should they show those attributes, are more likely to be punished for them. And I'm talking about women, I'm talking about people of color, that when they show up as more argumentative, because that's a behavior that we value in this organization, or they show up as more commanding, it can be read in really negative terms. So rather than using these terms that we know when we interrogate them through an equity and inclusion lens are not accessible to everybody, how about instead using specific examples? So rather than is commanding, what about an example like has been able to take stakeholders through a process from point A to point B, etc. Something that's really concrete, that is accessible to anybody in your organization. Use really specific examples. So that's the first quick win that I want to just give you today. Take it. I know lots of organizations already have these rubrics, but if you don't, get those written down and interrogate the language you're using on them. And when line managers are using these rubrics, right, ensure that they have some sort of checklist or coaching partner or somebody they can engage with, because they might make a mistake, and having someone else there to spread that accountability with is key. And the other thing I wanted to say that is a quick win, again, just as you said, Sable, in case folks are like, okay, I've done an analysis and I'm totally overwhelmed. Where can I start? What can I do right away that will create change? An area for me that is a quick win is creating mechanisms in your organization as part of your promotion process that allow line managers, forget allow, that actually encourage line managers to identify and gather the successes of their reports, the achievements of their reports, not at the end of a cycle, but much more regularly. What I mean by this is, you know, so often you see in an organization, a review for promotion takes, you know, it's after a year or it's
a year.
Months. Right, exactly, it's a year. And suddenly a line manager has to remember all the things that their report did over that period of time that were successful and that therefore are evidence for them to be promoted. Now, firstly, even without applying an equity and inclusion lens, here's the thing, memories are really fallible. So the idea that you're relying on someone's memory is problematic there.
Yeah, for sure.
The other problem is, and this is something that I think about a lot, is when you look at it through an equity and inclusion lens, achievements, individual achievements, the merit people get from them and the memorability of them is often associated with their identity. And I think a lot about Jocelyn Bell Burnell, the astrophysicist, you know, the extremely famous astrophysicist over here, that, you know, she was responsible for discovering radio pulses, right? She didn't win the Nobel Prize for that, though, did she? 2 men won the Nobel Prize, her advisors. That's a really good example of how historically, and we have seen this with people of color, we have seen this where because of people's identities, their achievements are not merited to them and not assigned to them, or even worse, are just not remembered and not seen as important. We know that has happened historically. And so the way that we can disrupt that loop, that potential, is to create much more regular moments that line managers have to sit down and go, what's my report done recently that is an achievement that could be something that could help get them promoted. It also, if you have shorter, more regular moments to do that, shorter feedback loops, the great thing is, if an achievement has been misassigned to the wrong person, somebody can query that much faster in the moment because it's just happened, versus a year down the line for someone to be like, oh no, wait, I think I was the one that did that on that one project. I mean, that's really hard to remember. I'm sure, just to be clear, that Jocelyn Bell Burnell remembered later. I'm definitely not saying that escaped her, and a lot of other amazing thinkers and doers around the world that haven't been credited for what they've achieved. But I do think, look, having these regular moments, it might be that at the end of a project, every project in your organization, there's a questionnaire that goes out, and everyone has, and I've seen this before, everyone has to fill out the achievements of other people during that project. Mm-hmm. Or maybe it's just in your one-to-ones. One of your one-to-ones with your report a month, you dedicate to mapping together achievements, so that when it comes to that promotions moment, you're ready, you've got it all there. You're not relying on memory. I think that's really important. And yeah, I constantly think, you know, if we had those in place, we wouldn't lose some of those really important achievements along the way. So yeah, those are, I'm giving Sable those quick wins in case you say like overwhelm.
And with the short cycles, what stands out to me as well is not only do you compile a list of achievements that are fact-based and on paper and agreed on prior to this like annual review process, because most places have an annual process, they're not even doing biannual, is that in the event that, you know, this person, and I'm just going to say this diverse member of staff is having, you know, a rough time closer to the time of the reviews process, we're not penalizing folks, you know, in this promotion process because maybe they just landed on a really hard client that has been it's just been a tedious process trying to get things over the line. And we're not judging the last 12 months over the last 6 weeks. Because oftentimes when we have these informal processes and then we aren't writing anything down for anyone to refer back to refresh, it's like, you know, you ask Sara wouldn't do this, but Sara, how's Sable doing? And Sara's like, you know, it's been a struggle. Yeah. You know, this new client, and she's just, you know, she's usually good, which isn't, you know, in a promotions process, good doesn't get you to the next level. It's like she's usually good, but she's really, you know, this current client is, you know, is giving her a run for her money. And then everyone's like, well, guess Sable's not ready for the next level, completely forgetting and not thinking about all of the clients that say, I don't know why I'm talking third person here. It works with the example. You know, what I did the other 10 months out of the year. You know, these shorter feedback loops actually allow you to paint a full picture, and a full picture gives greater chance at a fair picture.
Absolutely. And do you know what really jumped out as well when you were saying that? There was also development opportunities across that period of time as well, because we're talking a lot about successes and achievements as though they just come out of nowhere. Quite often, for all of us, the pathway to promotion relies on us being given development and stretch opportunities. It relies on us being given visible kind of projects, so certain people see us in certain positions. It requires us being given trust to work on high stakes client work, for example, etc., depending on your organization. And that's something that's really just jumping at me as you were saying that. It's also who is getting what development opportunities. When we talk about the promotions process, that involves all of those development conversations, development opportunities and projects that allow people to show their potential. And again, we know if we apply an equity and inclusion lens to it, we know the people that are most likely to be given high stakes work, to be given visibility opportunities across a business, that are given those stretch projects sooner, are likely to be those that are not from marginalized communities. We know that can happen. There can be assumptions, negative assumptions around folks from marginalized communities. They're not ready. They don't have the kind of client the relationship building with clients that we need because they're not similar to them, etc., etc. We hear those assumptions. And so I think something really simple also, here's another quick win, do tomorrow. Do you have a centralized place in your team, in your organization, where you all put stretch projects and development opportunities or high stakes projects so that they can be given out at, at worst, at least given out, on a rolling basis. So say you have, I don't know, a team of 18 analysts. Each new development opportunity that comes in gets given to the next person. So they're not all going to the same person. That's, that's a measure that could work, but you could do one better than that. Are you actively tracking and ensuring that development opportunities are being given to marginalized people with marginalized identities in your organization so that they are having direct access to those opportunities? And that might not be something you're able to do within the culture of your organization, in which case, at least just have a centralized place where those opportunities go up and a clear process that means they get given out on a rolling basis, so you don't have the same people being given these opportunities again and again and again, which can happen. And then it's what's the word I'm looking, it's a vicious cycle, right? Because suddenly it's like, yeah, but Tom or Betty, whoever it might be, they always do such a good job on those projects. It's like, well, that's because they've had the opportunity to do
lots of practice.
Right. So yeah, development's coming out to me a lot. And again, we don't always think about promotion as development, right? But it's directly connected.
So you have on the left-hand side all of the steps of the process. Right now we're talking about promotions, but this could truly go for any process. Across, you have, the different identities. So the different systems of oppression. You can have racism, sexism, anti-Semitism, disableism, cissexism, also known as transphobia. You can put everything across, okay? And then you go through your system, you go step by step. So on this left-hand side, you go step by step. Part one of the process, talk to your manager. How might that show up differently for different identities? And then, of course, you have to take into consideration the identity of the manager. That's another variable to throw into the equation. When you do this, Marie, every step isn't going to show up under every system of oppression. Sometimes nothing is there. There are no barriers. That's just a step to the process. Sometimes there are barriers. Once you do this matrix, you start from row one. I'm thinking we're in an Excel spreadsheet here. You start from row one, you go all the way down to row 32, I think is the number I picked. Once you do this from start to finish, you're going to start to see similarities in these barriers. So oftentimes when we do this, folks say, oh my God, we just discovered 100 barriers. And you just go into a state of like stuck, overwhelmed. What is it in science? Flight or fright? You just freeze, okay? Because it's like, this is way too much. Now I have to address 100 barriers individually. Because you're right. If you're both Black and woman and disabled, how does this work out? And Muslim, oh my God, how am I ever going to do right by this person in the promotion process? When you do this, again, steps across, you're going to see similarities. In this, I'm going to call it blocks. In these blocks to the barriers, you're going to block the barrier so it's no longer a barrier, okay? Or you break down the wall. That might be a better visual, actually. In these knocking down of the barriers, the strategy to knock down barrier one, if you look across your grid, it actually will knock down 3 other barriers. And then you find another barrier like, oh, this is a good solution for this barrier. And then you pull back on your spreadsheet, you zoom in. If this is a big whiteboard and you're in an office, everyone just like rolls back and they're in a row and they're staring at this big board and they're like, oh, this solution actually knocks out these other 10 barriers. When you take the time to do the matrix, it can take a couple of days, folks. This is not something that happens in an hour meeting or 2-hour meeting. You often have to go away, come back with fresh eyes. When you take the time to do that, that's where the bulk of your time gets spent, because you begin to realize a solution to this barrier is actually a solution to 5 other barriers. It's actually a solution to 12 other barriers. It's actually a solution to 15 other barriers. And now we just need to execute on 10 changes to actually make the process more equitable. 10 changes is you can conceive 10 changes when you were like, whoa, there's 100 barriers. So that's where you would address someone who has, who is at the intersection of racism and sexism and, anti-Semitism. You will address that without having to go, oh, I need 3 separate solutions. So that's just an answer there. Sara, I talked for a minute. So is anything you want to add to that?
That was mic drop moment. I just have to, I'm just underlining it, double clicking on it, plus oneing on it. Just love that idea of when you actually see it mapped out, how many similarities there are and how many things you can actually bring together and build holistic solutions for them together. So if you haven't done that process before, I can totally understand, because we do it in our Design for Inclusion program. The very end of our Design for Inclusion program, we do that with folks. When you first see the grid, you're like, oh my goodness, exactly as Sable spoke to. And then when you've actually done the process, you're like, oh, you can group things together. And then there might be some experiences for some people that are very unique and sit outside of that and need separate solutions. But the number of, because this is the thing about marginalization, folks, is that so many of the dynamics, so many of the structures that marginalize different communities often operate with some of the similar logics. There are unique differences within there, and we have to honor that. There are also shared logics. And so it's really useful to go into it saying, I'm going to be really thorough with all these different systems of oppression, but I'm also going to look for similarities and be opportunistic about how I can create holistic responses there. We are getting more questions in Sable, which is so exciting. Where do you want to go next? There's lots coming in.
So I'm going to, I'm sliding, I should have locked the wheels on this chair. I'm going to go into this next one. It's a little bit longer, so I'm going to paraphrase, but this idea of, loving and not loving, but appreciating this notion of accountability and transparency and how, writing it down can make it clear, but just also wanting to add in a layer of nuance. How do we, I'm paraphrasing here, but the use of the written word is valued, I'm going to use your words, are valued more in certain cultures versus other. Are there other ways to measure or notice positive qualities for promotion that honors, other communication methods that isn't necessarily the written word?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and seeing that. And I think the thing we have to be honest about is that, unfortunately, if we don't have extreme clarity, if we don't say to people, this is what it takes to get from this level to the next, if we create room for that grey area, what we know is oppression and inequity, I think, really breeds on subjectivity. It really breeds on lack of clarity, and it allows people also to lack accountability. Oh, but I thought you were saying this, not this, so that's why I did it this way. So the answer to that, which might not be necessarily what you might want to hear, is I would be really reluctant to create many different communication methods through how you are defining what people should be doing to get from one level to another. That is really important. I'd be really reluctant to say, do this or do that, because you're going to create layers of confusion, or confusion is the wrong word, but layers of different interpretations, and we want to avoid that. The point of this process is really to avoid that. Mm-hmm. So I'd say, if you feel as though having it written down in a document, you want something else to really, and I think this is also to really give it life and make it memorable, because writing can, I love the written word. I've been a reader my whole life. I'm half Iranian. I come from poetic people, but I get it. Sometimes that's not going to be our chosen method. A diagram can be hugely useful on this, but I would be really careful not to take it too far into the dialogical space, the discursive space, because that's where you are going to build a lack of clarity. And unfortunately, with something like this, we just can't afford for that. Because if what we're saying is we need everybody to know exactly what it takes to get from here to here, if we start to build a little bit, you could do it this way, or you could do it this way, and we're kind of verbalizing that in lots of different ways with folks, the danger we have there, as I said, is that some people can go, oh, I thought you meant this, so I just did it this way, so that's why I promoted this person but not this person. The only way we get there is through extreme clarity. And unfortunately, what we know about the written word is it stays in one place. That's not always strictly true, actually, but predominantly it stays in one place. But what I would say to add to that is, and I think, say this makes me think of our organization, it has to be a dynamic document. It has to be a document. It has to be a rubric that changes over time, that evolves, not just with the organization, but also evolves with all of your understandings of language and anti-oppression and inequity. It might be the first time you write that rubric, folks. You do use language that you think is equitable. And then over time, as you build trust with certain communities, you realize certain language is not so equitable. And I think that's the real thing with language. Language can be appropriated and can be used in ways which can further oppression, even if it's not the first thing we think of when we see that term.
One thing that stood out to me just now, Sara, and I'm just going to throw it out there. It's unfortunate that the written word is prioritized in some cultures, most notably, let's say, American and European cultures over other cultures. Like, that is supreme, go written, and then everything else secondary or what have you. One thing that I was thinking about as you were speaking, Sara, is this notion of, if we go into oral or even visual, we're still dealing with a dominant culture in that aspect, because Sable talks with her hands. You've noticed this. If it was a presentation, that's being judged by folks, even if you give me the opportunity to express orally versus writing down or doing, a formal deck, if you will, because decks are, in marketing and business and so forth, decks are important. If you don't appreciate the way in which I orally present myself, I'm still going to be penalized by virtue of I'm not hitting your standards of how someone is supposed to speak, the cadence, the accent, the way in which the body is used or not used. So you still end up in this space of nuance, and words can absolutely become subjective, and we can find the nuance within it. And I'm going to say, personally for me, I'm going to pick oral over, written. I don't mind the written word, but can I just talk? There might be, and I'm saying might very strategically here, less room for misinterpretation if we go the written route versus if we go another route. But I'm looking at the time, and we have another question that's, oh, I'm loving this. Intentionally focusing on building a diverse promotion pipeline via feedback on promoting on merit and not disadvantaging majority populations who may be perceived as stronger performance. And then threw in, I'm trying to better coach HR business partners on how to have these discussions with their clients. I have thoughts, but Sara, you go. Plus, I told you much. We don't have much time left.
Sharon, that's a brilliant question.
It was probably going to be our last question just based on time, but Sara, you go. I have so many thoughts.
Yes, and apologies to people if we can't get through all of your questions. I just love how engaged you all are, though. It's amazing to have them all come in. Sharon and everybody else, the first thing to say is there's a phrase that some people use, and I'm going to butcher it now. I'm not going to say it correctly, but essentially is along the lines of, equity can feel like oppression to some people because it's shifting the terms, right? And if you are advantaged within the status quo because of your identity, a world that is fair and just and equitable, well, maybe you're not going to have access to those advantages anymore. And so understandably, I'm going to change it, but not understandably, but inevitably, there's going to be feelings around this idea of, okay, we're just promoting people on merit. This is a total meritocracy, that for some folks, there's then a feeling of, but I was seen as a high performer because the way that performance was thought about before was highly aligned with my preferences and what's accessible to me. The key thing here, and I think, honestly, Sharon, this is what it comes down to, is you've got to ask yourself, before you create these rubrics, before you do anything, the first step has to be, what is going to be the best for our business aims or for our organizational goals? Whether you're a charity, an international charity, or you work in consumer goods, whatever it might be, these rubrics have to reflect what is fundamentally the best for the business. And it's after you've done that you then go through them and look at, okay, how is language maybe advantaging some people over others. What we're not saying is you start from a place of and building the rubrics in line with perhaps the preferences or the ways of being of certain communities over others. No, you start from what is best for your business, which anyone in your business, if you say that to them, they're on board. What is best for our organization? But it's then you interrogate the language used so that it's accessible. What you're saying is accessible to people from marginalized communities also. So an example I might use there is, well, you know, it might be really necessary in, I'm going to say like a client facing role in a certain organization, that you are able to command space, to talk to lots of people at the same time, one to many, and do it in a way which is really compelling. That's great. If that's absolutely necessary for the business to progress your business aims and so on, that's fine. But how are you going to write that down and make that clear to people, number one, in a way which is accessible to all? So saying be commanding, well, some people, as I said earlier, if they're commanding, they're punished for that. So instead, what about if you say be able to present work one to many, right? You're not using this subjective term that people can interpret in different ways. But the second thing is there. So firstly, you're using examples, not just terms. Probably, I used to be an English teacher, folks. It's probably a better word for that. But also secondly and critically, that you're looking at that and you're saying, okay, that is necessary. To be promoted, you need to be able to do that. Then you're looking at who gets given the opportunities to practice and get good at that. That's the development opportunities piece. Let me look at how I can build people's exposure to doing this and build their skills in it so that everybody has access to that. So what we're not saying is build the rubrics themselves in line perhaps with EDI thinking. Don't start with that. Start with what your business needs, then interrogate the language. Are you using examples or are you using subjective language? And number two, how are you giving people the opportunities across your business to get good at these things? How is everybody getting access to that? So that's something I'd just be clear on. But going back to what I said at the very beginning, there will be feelings with equity and inclusion work. There will be feelings. There always are. And that is part of the work. Sable, I went on and on and on there, but I'm sure you've got something really useful to add.
I do, but I'm also looking at the time. Because I'm notorious for not looking at the time. So I want to throw this in for folks who have to leave us now. One, thank you for coming, spending your early evening, potentially early morning or afternoon with us, because we're across a few different time zones here. We've enjoyed having you. You can stay in touch with us. We're on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn. It is always Fearless Futures. There are more webinars